wondering how I got into this mix. Mind playing tricks and I'm fiending for a fix. Habits overriding, imploding into explosion. Tapering away like ocean coastal erosion.
This is Derrick Broze with the Conscious Resistance Network. I'm coming with you today with a guest that I've spoken with before, but we had some small errors on the audio side of things, so we're going to do it again. I think we have a good reason to catch back up with Mr. Scott Crow. Scott is, if you don't know his work, he's an anarchist, an activist, an author, a great thinker, and he's put out some books. But more importantly, what we're talking about today is he's been involved in the community and different communities and helping show that what anarchism in action looks like, which is something I'm a big supporter of. How you doing, Scott?
I'm great, Derek. Glad to be back on. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so today what I want to talk about is we're checking it back in with you because we're at the 10-year anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, for one. And for those who may remember, especially down here in Texas, that was something that really hit the area hard and affected a lot of communities in Texas and New Orleans. The whole Gulf Coast was suffering and dealing with that, and also dealing with the failures of FEMA and other government organizations, and also a weaponized, militarized police force. And Scott was involved with the efforts of the Common Ground Collective, which did some amazing work. So, Scott, I'd like to let you, I know you've told this story a million times, but just tell us all about your work with the Common Ground Collective and how you first got involved with that and what it led to.
Thanks, Derek. Well, the Common Ground Collective formed in the aftermath of the devastation of Hurricane Katrina. And remember that Hurricane Katrina was a man-made storm as much as anything. And I think this is really important to draw out. One, because of environmental degradation, climate change is real, and it's causing some storms to be much more intense. Secondly, because of extraction processes and digging deeper and deeper for oil along the Gulf Coast and in the Gulf of Mexico, and through the bayous in the mouth of the Mississippi River, they've just been digging out all the wetlands that would protect the lands to keep the storms from moving into shore. So Hurricane Katrina was able to not only be a huge, powerful storm, but also move further inland than it ever would have normally because of all the sandbars were gone, all the marshlands were gone. The other thing I think that's really important to think about is the absolute criminal neglect by the U.S. government at all levels, city, county, state, and federal. They left tens of thousands of people to die. People on their rooftops, people in their attics, and because they substandardly built the levees, New Orleans flooded. And I think those two pieces need to really be, people need to be reminded of that. It's absolute criminal neglect of what the government did, the response to that, because when people were left to die, the government was way more interested in establishing law and order than it was helping grandmothers and uncles and babies and families to get out of their attics, to get off the rooftops, to get food and water, to get basic supplies. And the reason I ended up going there was because of relationships, and 20 years of political organizing took me to that point, basically. I had a friend who was living there named Robert King, and he was a former member of the Black Panther Party who had spent more time as one of the longest held people in solitary confinement in modern U.S. history. And he was imprisoned at Angola prison and all through the 60s and the 70s until 2001 when he won his just freedom. And when he won his freedom, he was living in New Orleans, and he was in New Orleans when the levees broke. And so I was worried that he was going to drown. This man who had given his life to end prison rape, who had fought for better conditions in prisons, who had really worked to desegregate the prisons, him and other people, I didn't want him to die in a flood or to be shot by the police because he didn't evacuate or couldn't evacuate. And so a friend of mine at the time, a man named Brandon Darby, and I went down. So the storm came ashore on Sunday, the levees failed on Monday, martial law was declared on Monday afternoon, and then we were there on Wednesday. And then we just started doing search and rescue. But I saw the aftermath immediately, what it was. I knew that we had to do something because the governments were already failing. Like I said, and I don't mean just federal government, all governments were failing, the city, the county, and Red Cross was failing. Tens of thousands of people couldn't get out. for different reasons, either because of economic reasons, because they didn't have access to gas, they didn't have anywhere to go. You know, New Orleans and the Gulf Coast region around there is historically very poor. You know, former slave plantations, and so there's a lot of poor people there. And you know, there's intergenerational housing, and people have lived in New Orleans for 200 and 300 years. I know a lot of people who have friends, and I mean, who have families who have been there for 200 and 300 years. So there wasn't a lot of infrastructure to help the people to get out. And I've heard in, you know, more recent years that people are blaming, well, they should have done this, they should have done. They couldn't. There was no way. If you had money, there was no way to get gas for hundreds of miles. If you had a car, you had money for gas. So all of these reasons kept people there. But instead of using all the school buses, the hundreds of school buses that I saw, or the military vehicles that were coming in to just start getting people, no matter what, like just moving people in, not just to the Superdome, but out of harm's way, they just decided to shoot looters and just declare martial law. And so this is the situations that we came into. And so we just started doing search and rescue. And in seeing all this aftermath, one of the things that also I saw that there was two white militias that formed. One had formed in the French Quarter on the river, and then one formed south of the river in Algiers neighborhood. They called themselves the Algiers Point neighborhood. And they were basically a bunch of white men driving around drunk, shooting black men because nobody was going to stop them. And then you had the police who had lost their command structure and were absolutely out of control, who were also killing people. And you have to remember, too, that historically the New Orleans police has been one of the most corrupt police forces in the United States since their beginning. You know, they basically had slave plantations with the overseers on it, on horseback. They just gave them badges and then called them the police. And that's been their legacy since then. So these two groups were killing unarmed black men who were supposedly looters. They were chasing down people. They were robbing people. And, you know, we didn't know all of this at the time. We just suspected it. So from this, I was invited in, myself and this other white man from here were invited in to take up arms with black men in the community, in one of the communities in Algiers, to help protect that community from being shot, from being killed by the police or the militia. And all this time, you know, again, 20 years of political organizing and personal relationships have brought me to that point. But when I was thinking about it, I was looking at it historically. Where would I have you? I was scrambling for a point of reference. And so I was like, well, what would the Black Panther Party have done in these situations? Well, they would have organized their community. What would the Zapatistas do? And what did the Zapatistas do? They organized in their communities for self-determination. And what would I do with political orientation of an anarchist? Is I would start to organize. You know, I see the need. I can't wait on governments. I'm not going to wait on governments. I see the failures of governments. So we need to start doing things. And from that, I started thinking about building this organization built on networks that anarchists had built around the country. The street medic networks, which are basically like medical professionals who come in to help protesters. It'd be like people with EMTs or paramedics or doctors or holistic health practitioners go and set up temporary clinics. Legal teams, eviction defense teams, all these things, all these networks that had built up in these anarchist communities over the last 15 years, we were able to call them in and say, look, could we do this? Because the idea was to help people to build infrastructure that had never existed in these communities and to rebuild infrastructure that had fallen down under the long, slow history of capitalism. By neglect and economic deprivation and lack of access to resources. The thing is, we weren't going to come in and save everybody. We wanted to support these communities to build their own power the way they saw fit, block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood. And we wanted, and you know, it's something like what the Black Panthers call the survival programs pending revolution. If people want to get to their revolutionary potential under terrible situations, they have to build the basic survival programs to make that happen. Healthcare, food, education, all of these things on a small scale. And so that's what we wanted to do, was to help these communities build their power the way that they saw fit by asking them. And so from that, we started this organization called the Common Ground Collective. And there was 3 people who started it. there was a man named Malik Rahim, who was also a former member of the Black Panther Party in the New Orleans chapter and had been in an armed shootout with the police in 1970 and had survived that, and he was a lifelong organizer. And then you also had Sharon Johnson, who was a woman who had worked as an office worker in Algiers, had never organized anything in her life, and but knew that the need was great for the people around her and for the communities around her. And so the three of us started this organization and ending up calling it the Common Ground Collective.
So what was the result of the organizing, and how long did it go on? This was started in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. How long were you said you were restarting old programs and kind of taking ideas from programs that existed around the country. How long did that full apparatus last? And also, I guess what I'd like you to touch on is the idea I've heard you speak on in the past that groups really shouldn't stay around for that long. Anyways, they should serve a purpose, and then they should dissolve or move forward. So how long did that all last?
Well, so Common Ground started. The first clinic opened 10 days after the storm, and it started as a clinic. It started as a first aid station, and then it was a full blown clinic about 2 or 3 days later when the first doctor arrived, official doctor. But the idea was what Common Ground did was to build an organization that had liberatory potential and also operated as a network. We basically became a vessel for people to build projects autonomously, and we would not register with FEMA. We did not register with Red Cross, and we would have nothing to do with them. And two, there's a couple of pieces that made Common Ground very different. One, you didn't have to have a massive amount of training. All you had to do was come in and be willing to do the hard, dirty work. Secondly, Common Ground volunteers were willing to use their privilege from being outside, from being largely white, largely being young, to break the law if necessary. So Common Ground had two approaches, really. We were doing relief work, the basic service work to help people, but building clinics, building food security, otherwise known as community gardens and individual gardens, aid distribution, things like that, cleanup, debris cleanup. We built a women's center, a bike program, all these different programs that we did. But at the same time, there were other injustices that were happening, like the destruction of people's homes, evictions that were happening. And so Common Ground volunteers put their bodies on the line to stop the bulldozers from being able to tear those things down, and also to stop when we started eviction defense teams. So when the sheriff's department came and evicted families and then left, we unevicted them and people put them back in their houses. And so Common Ground, or if Homeland Security had barricaded off a neighborhood and said that the people had to leave that neighborhood, Common Ground volunteers with food not bombs went through the barricades to feed those people or to offer them medical assistance, willing to break the law. And so we were doing this, but at the same time, we weren't trying to build power for Common Ground. We weren't trying to become the new United Way or the new Goodwill where we're going to fundraise like crazy. What the idea was to build power and then spin off the programs so that they were autonomous, that Common Ground wouldn't run them, but the communities to which they were served would run them. Because that's the way you build power, is that autonomous, collective, entities begin to spring up. And so we started to do that. So Common Ground operated as an organization where at its heyday between 2005 and 2008, you could have between 2,000 and 5,000 people on the ground doing 150 different programs or projects all across the Gulf Coast, in the Louisiana Gulf Coast and in New Orleans. But at the same time, many of those projects were spinning off and becoming autonomous. The Women's Center became autonomous. We had 7 clinics going at one point. And then they started to spin off autonomously. We had 4 clinics that were operating autonomously. But while all this was going on externally, we were also practicing anarchist ideals and praxis within Common Ground, and trying to practice power sharing and horizontal organizing and affinity group models and general assemblies. And building neighborhood associations, assemblies, so people could meet and talk in those communities. So we're trying all this internal power sharing stuff. We were also offering anti-racist trainings. We were trying to have liberatory potential inside. Now, it wasn't all amazing and beautiful. I mean, there was lots of problems. Sexual assault happened at Common Ground. Rapes happened at Common Ground. But you have to understand, in the first 3 years, We had 28,000 volunteers come through who either lived in New Orleans or came from around, and there so there was, and we were housing people in myriads of places because we were gutting buildings and churches, community centers, and houses. We gutted thousands of buildings, and so all kinds of people were coming through, and there was no central core of people that were running everything. There was multiple affinity groups, basically, of people who were running different projects, and so things like would fall through the cracks. And so even as many safe spaces as we tried to build, we still had sexual assault that happened over those years. We still had rapes that happened over those years, which is part of the reason we built the Women's Center, so women could have a safe place. We also created alternative safe places for people, for women and for trans people within different housing situations that we had. But we definitely inadvertently also created hierarchies of oppression. I mean, we saw race first and foremost because it was very obvious. Class is a very close second. But then the other forms of oppression kind of fell off the map as far as dealing with them actively and engagingly and intersectionally, I guess I would say. And those are some of the great mistakes that we made. But and that heyday lasted, but again, these are some of the challenges that we faced and some of the negative things. But while all that was going on, we were also being almost killed by the police. We were being threatened by the military. We were being raided by the police and Homeland Security. All of these outward things were happening while all this internal stuff was going on. And I'm saying all of this stuff very quickly, but if people could take home a couple of things and remember this. One, that everything that you think you know about civil society was gone. Everything was broken down at this point. So the point of references that we have didn't make sense necessarily there. And two, we were in a constant, all of us, everybody was in a constant state of crisis, a life and death crisis. And so we were trying to do triage where there's a top 10 list of things to do that were all emergencies, but everything really was number one. And so we had to choose what we were going to choose first, 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, before we could even get to 2 because the need was so great. And but when we built Common Ground, we never wanted it to just continue on, like I mentioned earlier, like a Goodwill or a United Way or something. The idea was that it would just build revolutionary potential, and then we would go away. We would just dissipate because once institutions become institutionalized, they often become part of a nonprofit industrial complex where their survival of the entity becomes more important than the actual work that they do, and we were worried about that a lot. It ended up happening to a lesser degree because we ended up, after 2008, turning Common Ground into Common Ground Relief, which became a professional nonprofit with an executive director. But the Common Ground that exists today, although they do great work, they still try to build worker cooperatives, they do house rebuilding, they do wetlands restoration, they work with tons of community groups on lots of projects. This weekend, on the 10th anniversary, they're going to be planting trees all throughout the lower Ninth Ward with a lot of people, with other people in those communities, because that's where Common Ground's headquarters is. But the organization is absolutely different than that liberatory potential that rose up in September of 2005.
So, you mentioned a couple of obviously the rapes and the assaults and the things that are the downside of just birthing a new, even a temporary organization. And what I've come across and I'm sure you have as well in my discussions and debates with other people, is when you try to discuss the idea of anarchy or putting anarchist practices into action, they have questions of, well, what if somebody does this, or what if somebody assaults somebody or rapes, and I feel like some people, what their misperception is that they assume that anarchy is a utopia, and that they're in the process of creating this more equal, free world, that there won't be actions like that there still won't be, because as we were talking about before the interview, there are still we're all dealing with the mechanisms of the world that limit our freedom and infringe upon our happiness, and they make sometimes some very fucked up individuals who do things that are hurtful to other people in their process of, you know, going through their own pain. And that those things happen. They happen now, and they would happen in the process of doing that. But I guess just your thoughts on how important is it to be able to address that before we get to that point, and, you know, what are the solutions for dealing with violence within our communities?
Well, I don't know what the actual solutions are, but I know the paths that we need to ask different sets of questions. If we don't want to rely on the state, not as this generic abstract or power, capital P power, then we have to figure out alternatives. What does it look like? What do healthy communities look like for ourselves? We have some vessels that we have used, like consensus decision-making, to try to balance the power within meetings where people can actually try to share power, hear voices that are not necessarily heard. But that's just a container. It doesn't actually create the liberatory experience. Accountability processes around rape, sexual assault, violence that communities have tried. Again, this is just a vessel, a mechanism to try to balance power outside of the state, but it actually is not it doesn't balance the power throughout the state. So, but the question is, I think we should ask ourselves constantly, what is it that we can do if we don't want to rely on the police, if we don't want to rely on the courts, if we don't want to rely on the medical professional systems that exist the way that they are, the informality of them, the inhumanity of them, then what do we want to do? In Common Ground, what we try to do is that we had a spectrum of violence in dealing with sexual assault, dealing with violence internally, because we did not want to turn people over to the police at all. One, because the police were our enemy, absolutely, thoroughly were our enemy. They tried to make our lives difficult. They almost killed me on 3 different occasions. They were not, so we didn't want to turn anybody over to them. So in doing that, we had to figure out a spectrum of violence that we were going to use. On one end of that spectrum was conversation, talking about things. Then you start to escalate tactics, the use of force, the threat of use of force, the use of force, and then what those use of force would look like. So we banished people, we beat people down, we held small accountability processes. I mean, not all at the same time, but in different spectrums of doing this. But there were shortcomings in all of this, because these were just vessels. But all the people who were engaged in the vessels hadn't worked together before, hadn't spent years working together, hadn't even spent years living together. So now you have people with semi-vague values, shared values, trying to use this vessel, this container, to try to deal with very desperate, very serious situations. There were some successes, but there was more often failures in dealing with that. But that's not a failure of the processes. I think it's just the way. I think that we just need to continue to ask questions and develop different processes that might root it in those processes, possibly.
Absolutely. I think that these questions are important to ask, because Common Ground really did, for a lot of people, I feel like it set the stage or set the idea out there for others who hadn't seen horizontal organizing and hadn't seen the creation of this type of action before. And we're looking back now 10 years on the work that was done by all the great volunteers, the people that you mentioned. So really, I think that we can learn from that, and it's important for us to ask those questions and to look at, like, as you've been willing to admit, both the faults of it and the promises of it, and that's important to do, to not be unwilling to recognize the problems in our institutions, because I think that some people will become so stuck, they'll become ideologues that they don't want to admit any faults or any cracks in their organizing or their plans. Instead of trying to improve upon them, they're afraid to admit, when they may have failed here or there, for fear of, I guess, painting the whole philosophy as a failure.
Been there too, that tension is it. But now but like the way I've developed those, I recognize that those tensions are there. They've always been there, and that we just have to recognize them. One of the critiques of my book, Black Flags and Windmills, that from some activists, was that I didn't cover it enough. But I didn't write a how-to manual. I just wrote a memoir that talked about the philosophies and foundations and some of the things. There's so many things I didn't write about because I just couldn't. There was just too much to write, And so we end up talking about them and exploring them more. And one thing I would like to say, even though we're talking about this, but it's talking about the narratives, of tensions and narratives too, is that I'm not here to become a giant hero. I wasn't the hero of this story. the thousands and thousands of people who did these things, whether they were from New Orleans or came from outward, are the heroes of these stories. The women and men and trans people that we never heard of are the heroes of these stories in my book. There's so many people that I'm so grateful for. I am just very fortunate because I'm a fast-talking white male who wrote a book about it. And I think that it's really important to remember that there's so many people who did so much that we will barely ever know about or never know about, especially on this emotional 10th year, and it's definitely been an emotional week for me.
Yeah, I can imagine that, there's a lot of memories and a lot of emotions coming up. I want to switch gears for a moment, and I'll let you go in about 10 minutes or so. I know you got things to do, but so I wanted to get into more generally just the topic of anarchy itself, and then a conversation that we've been having for a year or more now on the limits and the promises of both what some people refer to as left and right anarchy, and also the limits of those terms itself. And that opens itself up into a bigger conversation that we're going to work on for those who are interested in those topics. We're going to continue to develop this and put it out in its own form, just asking these important questions, and as we said, recognizing the limits and the ways that we can work together. But before we go into that, I know you call yourself an anarchist, but do you consider yourself to be an anarcho-communist?
I'm not an ideologue by any means. And I'm not saying this defensively, I'm just saying, I just want to be clear about it. Because I think there are many spectrums. Anarchy, to me, is a living, breathing, dynamic set of ideas and practices rooted in collective liberation, direct action, mutual aid, cooperation, just basic ideas. And so whether people call themselves anarcho-feminist, communist, individualist, any of those things, primitivist, I don't care. Those are labels they can throw on themselves, because we are all of those labels to degrees,
Labels, this is kind of what we're discussing here. The labels can be really divisive, and they're useful for political references. One of the big things that we come into as we get into this spectrum of individuals that identify themselves as anarchists philosophically, or like you were saying, it's just something that you do. To me, it's a way that you live your life, and it's a way that you interact with other individuals, and that's what's important. But when we get into this spectrum, we do find identifiers that might help us. Okay, I can work with these people, or I'm not sure I like their tactics, or whatever it may be. But often it's very limiting, because these terms, capitalism, anarchism, even to first, when you say anarchism, you have to spend the first few minutes explaining to somebody that it doesn't mean chaos and destruction and whatever the purge to anarchy, things like that. So, you have to spend the first few minutes doing that alone. But then when you try to, I threw on Facebook today, what does capitalism mean? And when last I checked before we started this interview, there was probably 15, 20 different definitions already. Some that you could probably lump together, others that were very conflicting and, definitely opposed to each other. So it becomes problematic. But, what are your opinions on that? How do we get past the limitations of language, or can we?
Well, this is something that was said to me by an old Black Panther a long time ago. When I was actually talking about being a white ally to them, and I was using the word ally over and over again, and he looked at me and he just said, "Will you just stop with that white ally shit? It's annoying." He's like, "Look, labels won't matter when they're shooting at us if we're in the trenches together. I don't care if you're white, black, brown, yellow, green, blue, whatever." He said, "It doesn't matter at all, as long as we're together, comrades shooting back." And, I'm paraphrasing it, but that's really the way it is. For me, is that I don't care what labels people care, if you consider yourself a radical or a liberal or whatever, if we are doing a single project together, or if we are, if we're facing off against common enemies together, or we're engaged. What I care about is the way that we engage together, and this is where the labels begin to ossify. Really, to me, if some anarcho-communist has this very specific idea of the way things are going to be. Some anarcho-primitivist has a very specific idea about the way things are going to be. Now, they have crossover, but they could be very much opposed. A syndicalist will very much oppose to a primitivist in the way that they think they organize. But really, that's because we have the luxury, even as capitalism is failing people all over the world, in the United States, people have the luxury to be able to debate those things in a meaningless vacuum, in my opinion. But What I care about is when disasters, whether they're ecological or economic, whether they're immediate or long term, how do we deal with them, and then how do we create societies, civil societies that we want to live in, and how do we organize those things? And whether we call it anarchy or not doesn't even matter to me. I think where those points of reference, I think that they're good for shorthand, but where they become problematic is when people have all the ideologies behind it. The other thing I think that's in this character that I think is really important to recognize is there's a hell of a lot of political immaturity and sociological immaturity within the political quote-unquote movements and the people who are engaging in the United States. We have a huge turnover because most of the political movements in the United States are based on activism. People who react to situations, bombings, disasters, police brutality, all the things that rise up really well. But what we do is we don't keep people in our movements, in political movements, very well because they are so reactionary. We don't build a lot of things, and so what we do is we have to reinvent the wheel over and over again with generation. And we're just at the precipice of being able to build political foundations and philosophical foundations that are much more mature in the United States, especially in the anarchist milieus.